June 3rd, 1851. Dear Levi, there are no signs of Indians last night, but everyone is jumpy as we prepare to start our day. We are within 20 miles of Fort Laramie, and there is some comfort. The grass here is much shorter and is called buffalo grass. There is a little timber to be found. It is not a pretty place. At midday, Hiram and I went over to visit Reuben. Frank had to help his pa with a broken wheel. Reuben gave us a drink of cider, and we sat in his wagon and to get out of the sun. We talked a lot about Mr. Hickman and what a bad thing he did. Reuben says that a person who never sees any good in others is very likely not to have many good qualities himself. I was listening to Reuben, but I couldn't help feeling curious about old Bill. The tabby was right where he had been, an old barrel sitting perfectly still. I finally got up the nerve and went over to it and touched its fur. It didn't budge or flicker an eyelash, and that's when I noticed that its eyes never closed the way a normal cat's do. I touched it again, and nothing. Reuben, I think there's something wrong with old Bill here, I said. He's got some kind of malady. Reuben just laughed. Well, I suppose so, he said. If you call being dead a malady. Hiram's eyes got as big as saucers. You mean to say he's stuffed? He asked. One could phrase it so, Reuben replied. I myself prefer to say preserved. We watched as Reuben went over and ran his hand lovingly down old Bill's back. Best friend I ever had, he whispered. Travels everywhere with me. I couldn't imagine traveling without him, and when he died I knew no other cat would ever take his place. See, old Bill and me are orphans, and we've got no family to speak of, not even a distant relative. So I found this fellow outside of New Orleans who was practiced the art of preservation, and now old Bill can always travel at my side. When Reuben went to check on his kettle of soup, Hiram tried lifting old Bill up. Why, he weighs more than a sack of flour, Hiram whispered. We took turns lifting him up and reckoned that he was stuffed with rocks. When I told the Morrisons about Reuben's cat later at supper, Mrs. Morrison made a face, but Charlotte and Lucy were eager for me to take them to Reuben's wagon for a look. Mrs. Morrison thinks it was very strange to stuff a cat. I told her I suppose I understand, being an orphan myself like Reuben, that a person could love a cat in a way that it was all they had in the way of family. That's when Mr. Morrison got his funny expression on his face. And that's when Mr. Morrison got this funny expression on his face and gave Mrs. Morrison a long look. She looked back and nodded. I didn't know what to make of it until Mr. Morrison cleared his throat and proceeded to tell me how much like a son I have always become to him. He asked me if I would like to settle down with him and Mrs. Morrison and the girls once we reached Oregon. He said he would help me settle Pa's claim and advise me on what I should do with it. I told him I'd like that, but I couldn't leave you behind. And do you know what he replied? He said, Austin is your brother of yours, is half the boy you are. We'd be glad to have him join our family, too. Charlotte and Lucy started clapping their hands and hugging me, and they even got Mattie to clap her hands, which set us all to laughing. Mr. Morrison and I stayed up late talking about his plans for farming. We're going to put on a big orchard with lots of apples and plums, and Charlotte overheard us as we called from the wagon, telling us to plant some peach trees for her. I told Mr. Morrison how you loved pears, so we'll have to plant pears too. Mr. Morrison knows a lot about farming. He says that the best laying hens are brown leghorns. I told him how Pa's always swore by the black Spanish breeds, and Mr. Morrison laughed. He says we'll have plenty of room in Oregon for all kinds of chickens, and we can have a contest to see which breed lays the most. You sure do have a lot of plans, Mr. Morrison, I said. He smiled and said, That's the beauty of this land. It's right for the plans and dreams of all kinds. But what if your dreams don't come true? I asked. What if all your plans don't work out? There's always going to be storms that you have to get through, Mr. Morrison said, shaking his head. No doubt about it. So, you grit your teeth to get through the spell of bad weather. The trick is to fix your eyes on the rainbow that comes after the storm. Now, there are some folks who spend all their time planning and scheming to keep out of the rain. There's one way to stay dry, but it's no way to live if you ask me. The Morrisons are fine people, Levi, and we'd be part of a real family. I'm thinking about the rainbow, and in my mind, I can see stretching clear across the prairie and on over to Oregon. Your brother, Austin.